Hello, this is Grandmaster Maxim Dlugy with Blitz Secrets. As the great chess master Savili Tartakov once said, many games has been lost by the unwillingness to sacrifice a piece. Today, we'll take a look at how to sacrifice pieces when defending. Let's look at survival tactics in Blitz. Sometimes you're faced with what seems to be impending mate. Your opponent has mustered up an amazing attack, and all you see are mating possibilities that lead to ruin. And at this point, you have to stop and consider some paradoxical, unorthodox ways of defending. Sometimes you have to part with your strongest piece, the queen, and look at ways of how you can get compensation for it. Most likely your opponent doesn't expect it, and if you can get two pieces and maybe a couple pawns for a queen, sometimes it's quite enough to effect a change in the position and certainly have a psychological effect on your opponent as you do that. Let's take a practical situation from the game of Hikaru Nakamura playing white and Vladimir Kramnik, the former world champion, playing black. This is a very sharp game indeed. So let's take a look. The game opens up with a Perk defense, one of the most complicated and sharp openings, very typical for Hikaru's style. He goes for mate immediately. He plays h4, not a very common line. Black decides that he has stopped it by playing bishop g4, but nonetheless, white continues with his attacking ambitions, and obviously after bishop takes h5, white will have numerous possibilities to continue the attack with maybe bishop c4, or maybe even rook takes h5. So instead, black decides that it's time for him to strike back in this as well, and plays c5. White takes the pawn on g6. Black recaptures with the h-pawn. White plays a very strong move, rook h4, trying to undermine this bishop on g4, while also potentially protecting this pawn on d4 with his rook. If, for instance, bishop takes knight, queen takes bishop, and not only is the knight attacked, but also the pawn on d4 is protected. So here, Vladimir thinks for a while and comes up with a very interesting solution. He takes the knight with the bishop, and after queen takes knight, moves the knight to b4, attacking the c2 square, a very strong threat, threatening to take, not only to capture with check on the c2, winning the rook, but also attacking the center as well. So it would seem on the face of it that white's position is in ruins. But Hikaru probably looked at this position before and understands that there are hidden tactics and hidden possibilities for white here as well. He comes up with an amazing move, bishop c4, giving his king space to leave from the knight check, but also adding more pressure to black's king's position. It's clear that, for instance, if black just captures the rook now, white's attack could become very shortly after a move like bishop h6. Black plays e6 to block off the attack of the white's bishop, at the same time attacking the rook. So this move seems to be extremely multifaceted, but the game is not by any means over. White plays the very strong move queen h3, lining up the rook and the queen after the possible move bishop h6 to get through to the h-file and deliver mate. Black snaps off the pawn with check, king f1, and now tries to get back some pieces into the game. Now, there were obviously more possibilities here than just knight takes pawn, but for instance, pawn takes pawn, knight e4, queen a5 would also threaten mate and trying to come back to the pawn on e5. But all of these positions are extremely complicated and maybe even favorable for white. Black captures back with a knight, and white increases the pressure by playing knight e4. I would say that this is a critical position in the game. First of all, black is only up a few pawns, which obviously will not matter if he gets mate. Black is faced with a number of threats. Some of the threats are bishop g5, followed by knight f6 check, and a very quick mate if bishop recaptures the knight. This is a very strong threat, and to defend against this threat, it's possible to just lose your head and say, look, I don't know what to do. I'm just going to give up somehow because I don't see how to defend against this threat. So at this point, Vladimir thinks about the position, and he understands that he will probably have to give up some material. So he needs to get as much for his material as possible. And he looks at this without fear, trying to understand what are the key elements of the position, what he needs to do not to get mated. First of all, not to get mated, he needs to control this rook, somehow get it off the board or get it off the h-file. Secondly, he needs to control the square. How to get both of these done is not so clear because, for instance, a move like knight c6 is handled by bishop g5. It's clear that black will be lost very quickly. After thinking for quite some time, he comes up with an amazing resource. He plays knight f5, attacking the rook. White plays bishop g5 as planned, and now he plays queen d4. Of course, without this rook, it will be difficult to deliver mate. White plays the most logical looking move, knight f6 check. Black takes back the knight with the bishop. The mate is not yet possible. Taking bishop with the bishop is not good because knight takes rook and the queen protects the knight so that it won't be possible to create the combination of queen and bishop mating. But of course, there is the issue of the queen hanging. So obviously white takes the queen with the rook and black simply recaptures the bishop. Now look at this piece situation. Basically, black has only 2 knights for the queen, but also 2 pawns. In a normal sort of game setup, if we started from scratch, this would not be enough. But in this position, black has also a number of other trumps. First of all, the e-pawn is weak because it cannot be defended by any of the pieces that correspond to the pieces that can attack it. So black can attack it definitely with the knight, and most likely with the bishop if it gets to retreat to g7. White can't really defend it with anything that would be of note, because if it's defended by a rook, he will not be able to sacrifice a rook for the minor piece. It won't make sense. So you could actually imagine that very soon black will get a position where he gets this pawn as well, and then he will have ample compensation for the queen. Black thinks for quite some time and finally comes up with this move order and gets into this position. Now, white's best was probably to play rook e4 to stop any check on e3. So now Hikaru is thinking in this position. Both sides have about a minute left. Defensive tactics are Vladimir's strong point. He didn't think too long to find this queen sacrifice and basically completely reversed the tables. And just a second ago it was white attacking, and now it's him defending and looking for the best ways not to hang something, because black simply has more pieces. In fact, Hikaru plays rook g4, which actually hangs in exchange, and it was possible to simply go knight e3 check, knight takes rook, and even though white has some compensation, maybe he can even win the e-pawn shortly, but black's position would be better, most likely. Instead of this, Kramnik plays according to his plan. He plays bishop h6, threatening knight e3 check, and threatening bishop g7 and knight c6. He understands that it may well be that his minor pieces will be stronger than the rook, because the rook will be looking for ways to escape from these minor pieces, while the minor piece will be invading the board all over, forcing white to spend valuable time looking for ways to avoid them. In this position, clearly white had to start thinking about defense and persevering. Moves like rook e1, knight c6, rook e4 would make sense to try to just hold down to this e-pawn, because once this e-pawn is gone, first of all, black will have enough compensation just even from a material point of view, but also the activity of his pieces would be just too much to resist. Unfortunately, it's very difficult to change your mindset, and Hikaru, from a very attacking position a few moves back, got into a defensive position that where he has to think differently, and he immediately makes a bad move, which really is a losing move in the game. He plays bishop d3, sacrificing back the exchange, knight e3 check, king f2, knight takes rook check, king g4, and black plays knight c6 just now. The threat is to take the pawn. Very difficult to defend this pawn. Some sort of a move like bishop takes pawn is not good, because this is a recapture with check, since the king is not very well placed on f2. White plays rook h1. Of course, black could simply take this pawn with a knight, and after the retreat of the queen, go bishop g7 or take the bishop. But he's in no hurry, and he simply makes the move bishop g7, understanding that knight takes pawn is impending and white will not be able to stop it. So let's see how Hikaru creates chances from this already quite hopeless position, even in terms of material. He plays queen h4, threatening mate, rook d8, and now he understands that his only chance is to open up the game somehow. He sacrifices the bishop. Bishop takes pawn, pawn takes, queen check, king f8, rook f1, trying to create some counter chances with the rook added into the fray. Rook d7, and let's look. White has 10 seconds left to Kramnik's minute. Queen takes pawn, rook check, king e1, knight takes e5. There was a pawn there somewhere. Rook takes, knight takes, and it's not possible to take the e-pawn because rook e8 wins the queen. Queen e4, rook b8, b3, b6, queen c6. White plays almost instantaneously. He has 10 seconds to black's 55. And of course, this is a winning position just by virtue of black having rook, bishop, and knight for the queen. And he plays bishop e5, queen d7, a5, queen takes pawn. He manages to take this pawn, bishop d6, king f2, b5, creating a passed pawn, g4, counter chances, bishop e7, blocking them, queen a6, attacking the pawn on a5, a4, takes it. And now Kramnik decides to think finally. Plays bishop, pawn takes pawn, queen takes pawn, rook b4, attacking the pawn on g4. He at least wants to take all the pawns. If he takes all the pawns, there won't be really much compensation. Queen d7, rook d4, strange move, for it to be normal to check and take the pawn. Queen f5, king g7. White is thinking, but he has no time to think, so he loses on time in this position. The position remains lost. Obviously, the pawn is, both this pawn and the a-pawn are blocked. So while black didn't really make any progress on the last few moves, he certainly didn't ruin his position, as we've seen in the game where black had a similar advantage in material when Morozevich was playing black against Carlsen. White couldn't handle this with a few seconds on his clock and lost on time. So we saw in this game this survival tactics, that when you get close to being mated, look for the most paradoxical defense. Most likely your opponent hasn't seen it, and you'll be able to surprise them and turn the tables. In the next game, we'll see how White uses the tactics to his advantage in a situation where both sides are very short on time. This was Grandmaster Maxim Dlugy. Think better, play faster, watch Chess TV.